Hello, yarnaphiliacs, and welcome to a new episode of Yarnaphilia, where today we are going to discuss the 3-needle cast-off technique for knitting. Now, as we know, every knitting project has a start, a middle, and of course, an end. So, today we are going to discuss another way to end this project. So today's project is a hoodie. What you're looking at here is the hood, and I'm going to show you how we're going to bind off this hood, making one neat seam. So here's the shoulder. I did a usual method where I binded off the shoulder on each side and then sewed it together. I'm giving you guys a look at the hoodie. It doesn't really fit all the way on screen, but there's my armhole there, and you can see the shoulder. There's the front with the pocket. Boop, right there's my pocket. And of course, there's the hood for the hoodie. So again, as you can see, there's the seam I did where I just binded off each of the ends and sewed it together. And you can see that seam is kind of lumpy, it's thick. And I used the original fabric, the original yarn of the project to sew those seams together so it would look a little bit better, because if you can look closely, you can actually see the yarn coming through there from where I sewed it together. But what we're going to do right now is a 3-needle bind off, and that is going to create a neat hood. So instead of just binding off the project and then sewing it together, we're just going to do a simple 3-needle bind off. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to do a regular bind off. Now I'm going to sew. First, I have to knit all the way to the middle of the hood to where I did that stitch marker right there. And then I will bind off in the middle after I turn it inside out towards the outside to create that neat seam on the hood. So that is what I'm going to have to do the 3-needle bind off. But before we do that, I'm going to give you guys a quick look at the standard bind off method, because the 3-needle bind off is very similar to the standard bind off method. So of course you've got your 2 needles because you're working on an existing project. So you're going to get both your needles together, and you're going to use a third one. Part of my wobbles here, everybody. When I filmed this, I did not have a tripod yet. It was in the mail. So we're using a gooseneck, which is a little wobbly. But since I'm using an interchangeable needle set, I'm using a spare needle tip from another size in the set. But for first, I'm going to show you guys the standard bind off. Pretty straightforward here. If you don't already know, we're going to learn today. So to do a standard bind off, you're just going to knit your first couple stitches. It doesn't really matter how many stitches you have ahead of this. What matters is that the stitch you're going to bind off needs to only be the second stitch from the end of the needle. So as you see that, right now I'm just binding off from the end to only have the 2 stitches. The one that's going to be bound off is in the back, and then the live stitch is in the front. And what you're going to do is you're going to take your working needle, your left hand needle, as you see there, you're going to get it under the binding off stitch. You're either going to pull that yarn tight on the live stitch, if you will, which is what I'm doing here. I'm kind of choking up on that yarn, and I'm also going to use my fingertip to keep the stitch on the needle, as you see right there, because the bound off stitch is just going to go over just like that, and it's bound off. And then you just keep on going. You're going to knit the next stitch, the next live stitch, and then the bound off stitches towards the back. Now this time I'm going to use my other hand, the one that usually holds the yarn, to hold the stitch down. So you want to make sure that you're also knitting these stitches very loosely. And you really want to make sure that you count appropriately as well, right? So the stitch that you're binding off is the back stitch. The stitch that you pull the bind off stitch over is what I'm going to call the live stitch, and does not count if you're talking about binding off stitches. So here I'm going to do it again. Instead of choking up on the yarn, in order to keep my bind off loose, I am just going to use my fingertip to hold the live stitch onto the needle. I'm going to use my other needle to just pull that binding off stitch over, hold it tight. And this can be a challenge for the first timers. I remember when I was learning how to knit, this was really hard. It made me kind of throw my needles, use some colorful words. As a 7-year-old, I was quite upset trying to bind off stitches without just dropping off all the stitches. So you really got to make sure you practice on this. Be gentle with yourself. You need to keep your yarn extremely loose when you bind off, especially when you're going to be sewing those seams together, like in this case, and how you're going to use that project, which also means that the needles might slide off. So be delving to yourself, be gentle to yourself. Make sure you keep things very loose. You see I'm doing it with my needles. I'm really pulling those stitches loose. I'm even using a larger needle that I really need to use. And once again, that back stitch is the one that's going to get bound off. I'm going to use my finger just to hold the live stitch onto the needle. And I'm going to get under there and pull it over. And see how I hold my finger on that live stitch until it's already pulled over, until the bound off stitch, the cast off stitch is fully casted off. And that's going to be the key to keeping that live stitch on the needle. So what I did there, I was just showing you guys the standard bind off. I undid it and I knit towards the stitch marker in the middle. And then what we're doing for this project is we're turning it inside out. Now, sometimes for the design, you may keep that bind off on the outside. But for this design, we're going to keep it on the inside, just the same way you would do if you were sewing the seam together. So we're always going to be discussing pattern interpretation here, opportunities to adjust the pattern. The original pattern called for binding everything off and sewing it together. This time I'm doing a 3-needle bind off because for me it is easier and it creates a much smoother and flatter seam, and I care much more about the seam of my hood being smooth and flat than I do about the seam of the shoulder. And for the sake of how the shoulder was constructed, it wouldn't have worked here. But so to do a 3-needle bind off, what you're doing is you're going to line up your stitches on both needles. You're going to use that 3rd needle to kind of knit together both of those stitches first, and then do the standard bind off later. So I'm going to show you that right now. I'm going to take this needle in. I'm going to go under the front loop like a regular knitting of both the front and the back stitch. So instead of knitting together the stitch next to each other, you're knitting the stitches in front and behind each other. I hope you guys can see what I'm doing here and it all makes sense. So I'm going to get behind the front loop here of the front stitch and then behind the front loop of the back stitch. I'm going to kind of knit those together and then bind off, and then to do the same thing for the stitch behind it. Here we go. And then bind off. So behind the first stitch, behind the front loop of the back stitch. See, just like regular old knitting together almost. Just about. So I knit those two together. Then do the same thing in the next stitch, behind the front and in the back. Knit them together. And to keep it nice and loose, remember, always bind off loosely. So now I can use either needle of the 2 needles in my left hand. Doesn't really matter. And it's going to do just like the standard bind off here at this point. Then I'm going to pull that back stitch over the front. Make sure I use my finger to hold that front stitch on the needle from falling off. And there you go. We'll do it again. I'm going to knit those stitches together. Use either needle and do like a standard bind off. Do the front loop of the front stitch, the back stitch, knit them together. And if you notice, I keep pulling the yarn pretty far there, and that's just to make sure that everything is nice and loose. You make sure you bind off loosely. This is a really important thing. It can get hard, especially if you're stressed out. If it's your first time doing this, you get a little nervous, and you might do things a bit tight. You really have to make sure that you're being loose here, because you can't really go back and loosen it up later. You just have to undo everything and start over, and that can be a bit of a challenge. So I'm giving you an up-close shot here. You're knitting those front stitches and back stitches together, and then you are just gonna bind off. Pull that back stitch over the front stitch on the right needle, and there you go. Keep that yarn nice and loose. That's key. See how it doesn't really matter which of the left-hand needles you use, as long as you know you can see what you're doing. And you see how it doesn't really matter how much of that right-hand needle you use, because in this case, since you're binding off completely, you just need something there. So in showing you guys that neat seam, look how neat that is, how clean, keeping things nice and loose. So it has some stretch and some give. And I'm even gonna turn it inside out for you so you can see how it looks like on the outside, on the right side. Perfectly even and neat seam. You can see how the stitches line up perfectly with each other, creating a very nice and even and neat look. This is much harder to do by hand if you were to bind off completely and just sew it back together, which is why the 3-needle bind off really comes in handy, because it saves you 2 steps. You do everything all at once, and you actually create a much cleaner and neater look than you probably would have gotten binding it off and sewing it together yourself. So here I'm close to the end, and you see how I'm really trying hard to keep my yarn super loose. I just cannot emphasize enough how important it is to keep your yarn loose while you're binding off. The bind off method kind of tightens up on its own, so you really just want to keep that yarn super loose. And I hope you guys can see that, how I'm really using those needles to pull that yarn out. Every time I do a stitch, I'm really pulling my needles really far away from the project, and that's just a way to loosen up that tension as I get towards the end. So as we discuss pattern interpretation more from a crocheting and a knitting side, it's important just to see that you got to read those patterns all the way from start to finish before you work on them. Look at the pictures of the finished garment. Ask yourself, what do I'm looking for? What do I need? Is there a way or a space where I can improve upon this? And don't be afraid to do so. So here we are at the last stitch. Of course, the last one's going to give us the most trouble. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Oh, still hit a snag. Nope, still got a little tight there, making sure it's loose. Gonna bind that off. And there we go, we're done. Now we just have that 1 stitch left over. Like any other time, every time you bind off, whether you do it the regular standard bind off or the 3 needle bind off, you're always gonna have that 1 stitch left over at the end. And you just cut your yarn and pull through, leave a nice long tail for weaving in. And there you go. Just like that, we did 2 steps in 1. And in the case of this project with this yarn, with that color striping, little irregularities like that really stand out. So now you can see there I actually probably made a little mistake on that hood. Probably wasn't supposed to have a sharp corner on the end. So that I think is a bit more about how the pattern was written. A little confusing there at the end when it came to the hood, but hey, this is a practice project. I do a lot of these. I highly recommend it. But just see, look at how neat that is, guys. Look at how clean and simple and thin. So that's going to be sitting on the top of your head as a hood. Wouldn't you prefer that neatness as compared to the much thicker and much bulkier seam that was in the shoulder? Right? So here you are getting a look at it from another angle. You can see just how simple and flat it looks on top, right? Just a little dimple. And on the inside, same thing, just a little bump, barely even noticeable. And there you go. Thank you. Bye.